All right, I got an uncomfortable question to start off with. How many of you here currently have, or at some point in your life, you have had a bad habit you just can't seem to break? Anybody with me on that one? Maybe your bad habit has to do with like losing your temper. And you lose your temper, and then you let loose a string of cuss words. Anybody here? You don't have to raise your hand for that one. And you're embarrassed by it, right? You know, like as a grown person, you shouldn't be doing that, but you just tend to do it. It's a bad habit. You've been doing it for a long time, and you're trying to break it. You're trying really hard, and you do good for a while. And last week, on the way to church, you kept your cool. And then in church, even though the pastor said something you didn't really like, you still were cool. But then after church, somebody cuts you off in traffic, and somebody in the back says something they shouldn't say, and then you let go, and your temper goes, and you let a bunch of things you shouldn't say come out of your mouth. And you're embarrassed. And so you go home, and you open up the fridge and eat half of what's in the fridge, another bad habit you're trying to break, you know? And then you like get on social media, and you scroll for like an hour, and you just feel worse. Another bad habit. And, we just have these bad habits. All of us have something. And nobody has to tell you it's bad. It's not that somebody else is judging you or pointing it out. It's your own personal evaluation. And you just want it out of your life, yet you just can't seem to break it. If you've ever wondered why that happens, I'm glad you're here today. We are in the 5th week of a sermon series titled Ever Wonder Why? And today we're going to explore the question, why can't I stop? Now, I do think when it comes to this bad habit, you probably have the right intentions. But maybe, just maybe, the reason you can't stop is you have the wrong strategy. And the reason I believe you might have the wrong strategy is simple. It's because change is complicated. And I have to tell you at the outset of today's message that this message is going to be incomplete. There's no way in 20 to 25 minutes I can address all the facets and the factors that go into change, because change is complicated. But that being said, we're going to spend some time talking about change. Now, when it comes to change, there's a whole lot of factors that go into it. One of them is a practical set of factors. For instance, you want to eat healthy. Yet all you have in your pantry is Twinkies and Ho-Hos. And so you just need a practical change. Buy some apples and some oranges and get rid of the sugary snacks. It's a practical change that you need to make. Another factor for change is emotional. All of us, we carry baggage from our past. And maybe you have an emotional wound that you need to explore in therapy. Maybe you need to read up on emotional intelligence. And then if you can address that, that is the factor for change for you. It's an emotional factor. But maybe the thing that is standing in the way of you stopping that habit, it has nothing to do with a practical factor. It's not an emotional factor. Maybe it's a relational factor. Maybe the reason that you can't change is because everybody around you is doing the same thing. You're doing drugs and all your friends, they're druggies. You have a negative attitude and everybody around you is negative. And you want to have a positive attitude, but it's hard to change when everybody else is going in a different direction than the direction you want to go to. And so quite frankly, you just kind of need some new friends or create some distance. Maybe it's a relational factor that is standing in the way of that change. And finally, one of the factors that might be standing in the way of change is physical. Some of us, just our neural pathways are conditioned in such a way that it doesn't matter the practical changes you make, the emotional, like it's no amount of therapy is going to help, no amount of change of friends. You just have a physical thing and you need to get on some medicine. Or maybe you have a physical ailment and it's just a physical thing that stands in the way of change. Change is complicated. And it could be any combination of these 4 factors, but there's a 5th factor that I think that we often underestimate and misunderstand. And that factor is a spiritual factor. And that's what we're going to explore today. Let me give you a definition of spiritual that'll probably just confuse you more, but if you stick with me, I think it's helpful. Spiritual things are things that are eternal and universal. Eternal and universal. When we're talking about spiritual matters, we're talking about matters that are eternal and universal meaning like it applies to everybody. You want to eat healthier, and you're not the only one here in the room that probably wants to eat healthier, and so you need to make a practical change, but not everybody has that issue. It's not universal. Or maybe your issue is that you at night you get in bed and you stay on this thing scrolling. You wake up exhausted every day because, like just 5 minutes on TikTok or Instagram turns into like 50 minutes like that. Anybody ever been there? And so you just need to make a practical change, and you just dock this thing somewhere other than next to your bed. You can do it. We make our kids do it. It's a healthy change. But you know what? This is not a spiritual matter because just a generation ago, they didn't even have these. Spiritual matters are things that are eternal. It's applied to everybody in every place in time. It's eternal and universal. It is about big things. I'll put it a different way. Spiritual matters are about questions like this. Am I loved? Am I accepted? Am I safe? Am I valued? These big, deep-seated questions. And that coworker that seems so confident, they have these questions too, even if it doesn't look like it. These are spiritual matters. They're eternal. They're universal. At every stage in your life, you're wondering these things, even if you make progress on it. And sometimes you try to deal with the fact that you have a spiritual need to be loved, and so you move from relationship to relationship, thinking that if you just have a relational solution to that deep-seated issue, you can change those habits, but it never works. Or you want to be accepted. And so you post on social media looking for those likes, and it feels good at first, but it doesn't really do it. Or you want to feel safe, and so you get the latest technology in home safety, and you buy a bunch of guns and that sort of thing, and you want to be safe. There's nothing wrong with trying to be practical, but sometimes we try to fill a spiritual issue with some other sort of solution. To put it a different way, many people try to meet a spiritual need with something beside God. And you have a God-sized need in your heart, and you try to fill it with another human being, and they can never live up to that need, and you shouldn't put that on them in the first place, and it never quite works out. Or you got this God-sized hole in your heart, and you're trying to fill it with alcohol, you're trying to fill it with shopping or eating, and it never quite works out, and you just get stuck. And so you are trying to fill a spiritual need. And maybe your issue, maybe the reason you can't stop is just practical. Maybe it's relational. But perhaps it's this deeper issue that if you dig down and you get really honest, you're trying to fill a God-sized problem with something other than a spiritual solution. And some of you might be like, hey, I get that. That's actually why I'm here. Like I'm coming to church and I understand God's need for my life, yet still I can't stop. And perhaps, just maybe, you're focusing on the poison of religion rather than the power of grace. To which you might think, hold on a second, Pastor Scott, like you're a pastor in a church. You're religious, right? And I would say, yeah, I am in a certain sense, right? Like a sociological point of view. Religion is just a set of values and assumptions and beliefs that we have that kind of help us format a framework to see the world. We're all religious in that sort of way. In fact, sometimes I meet people and they tell me, hey, I believe in God, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And I privately think like, well, yeah, you are technically speaking, because even an atheist is religious. We all have a set of values and beliefs and a framework. But when somebody says that to me, that's not what they're getting at. Instead, they're talking about a specific expression of religion. If you look at like how the word religion comes around, the etymology of the word, you find that religion has this association with obligation. When people say, I'm spiritual but not religious, they're saying, I'm not into all that obligation, all those things I have to do. To which you might think, well, the Bible is full of a lot of obligations. It's full of a lot of rules. You've heard of the 10 Commandments, and if you've been hearing me preach for a while, there's a total of how many commandments in the Torah? Anybody? 613, that's right. So there's a lot of rules in the Bible. However, if you were here this past fall, you might know that the biblical story, it involves a lot of rules, but it revolves around God's grace. That's the real storyline of the Bible. And grace, if I was to have one word associated with the word grace, it would be gift. Religion is about obligation in a certain sense, but grace is about a gift. And if you've earned it, it's not a gift, it's just a payment. My favorite place that this is talked about is in Ephesians chapter 2. This is a letter written by the Apostle Paul. He says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves. It is the," what does it say? Gift of God. Not by works. Not by meeting obligations. And then Paul throws something at the very end that is so interesting. So that no one can boast. No one can boast. Look at me. I've done it on my own. No, it's a gift. You didn't do it on your own. You can't boast. But religion is obligation. It leads to boasting. Or to put it a different way, religion as obligation will make you prideful. Look at me. Look at what I've done. I've kept all the rules. Why haven't you? And it also will lead to deception. Because you're not that good. Nobody is. You miss the mark sometimes in your life. You don't always hit the center of the target. And so if you're living with religion as obligation, this is why I talk about the poison of religion. When we think that if we just try harder, maybe we'll one day become perfect, it makes us be prideful, but it also makes us be deceitful because you're not that good. And so you have to hide the truth from others, and probably the most poisonous, from yourself. I want to take you to another one of Paul's letters, probably a letter you haven't spent a lot of time reading, which is the letter to his friend Titus. And at the beginning, he tells us why he's writing to Titus. He says, "The reason I left you in Crete," which is an island in the Mediterranean, "was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I've directed you." Well, why does he need to do this? Well, Paul goes on and tells us, "For there are many rebellious people, full of meaningless talk and deception. They're boastful, prideful. Look at me, look at what I've done." And they're deceitful. It's deception. Especially those of the circumcision group, the religion as obligation group. They, Paul says, must be silenced because they're turning whole families away from the truth by their false teaching. And if that wasn't bad enough, they do it only for money. Well, what is this truth that they're being turned away from? A little bit later in the letter, Paul just says it plainly. He says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people." How many of you here have heard the word gospel be used? It means good news. There it is. This is the gospel right here. For the grace, the gift of God, the unearned, unmerited favor of God has appeared that offers salvation. Am I loved? Am I valued? Am I okay? Will I be saved? What's going to happen to me at the end of my life? You are loved. You are valued. You will be okay because of the gift of God. It's not based on your character. It's based on the character of God. And you know who it's available for? All people. But you don't know what I've done. All people. The good people and the bad people. This is the gospel. This is the spiritual solution to that spiritual issue that all of us have, that goes down to our core, that is often behind all these bad habits that we can't stop. We're trying to fill it with one thing or another thing, and it never seems to work out, and we can't quit it because deep down it's something much deeper. But there's more. Paul goes on to say, the grace of God, teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives, not sometime in the future, not in heaven someday, but in the present age. It teaches you to live self-controlled. Now let me tell you something. Rarely do you learn anything overnight. You've learned stuff in your lifetime, right? We got a couple teachers in the crowd. Rarely do people learn things overnight. It's the repetition. It takes time, especially if it's something that's really important, something that is complicated like change. Rarely do you change overnight. And grace is going to teach you, but rarely will it teach you overnight. But if you give it enough time, it will teach you, and it will teach you to be self-controlled. It will teach you to live differently, but it doesn't tend to happen. Maybe for you, sometimes it does, but rarely tends to happen overnight. Put it simply, the grace that saves you, Paul's saying, is the grace that can sustain you. And it leads to a question. How does God's grace change us? Maybe the reason you can't stop is because you are relying on the poison of religion as obligation rather than the power of grace. But then, okay, how exactly does grace change us? Well, I think it's helpful to make a distinction between religion as obligation. The focus of religion as obligation is outward, and the power of grace is inward. Take you to Matthew chapter 23, to the teaching of Jesus, where we see this. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites, you play actors. You have this mask on and you're pretending to be something on the outside and you're very different on the inside." That's what hypocrites means. And when you see Pharisees, just think of religious people. Religion is obligation. Jesus says to them, "You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but the inside, they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean." In other words, Jesus is saying, if your heart changes, then your habit changes. If your heart changes, if you change on the inside, then you will change on the outside. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians, he has this prayer that addresses this. I love it. Listen to what Paul says. "I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, he, that being God, will empower you with inner strength through not your spirit, but his spirit." Paul is suggesting that there's a power available to you that is beyond your own resources, and it can change you. And it's changed me. And this is the point in sermon preparation where I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm making this claim. When has that actually happened in my life? And man, I'll tell you, immediately I thought of a story, and I really don't want to tell it. I don't. In fact, I'm thinking about backing out now. Can we just move on? We'll forget that I even said anything. I don't want to tell it because it's embarrassing. And I don't want to tell it because I'm afraid that you will judge me. And some of you will. You'll try not to, but you will. And some of you might even reject me. And my stepson's here. I wish he wasn't here to hear this. But it's a story that I was like, God, give me something else. And this seems to be the story to tell. So, can you all give me a little grace today? Yeah, that's not very convincing. I don't feel very good after that. Can you all give me some grace today? If you can't say yes. All right. Here we go, okay? You won't ever unlearn or unhear this. This is called 20-year-old Scott and lots of pot. As in marijuana. And I'm not judging anybody here. This is just my story. And I want to tell you from the outset that my current belief is that I believe in legalization, regulation, and moderation. I believe that about a lot of things. And you can differ from me on that, and that's fine. That's what I believe today. However, this story is not about moderation. This is a period in my life where, it was a lot. Like a lot. Okay? And what was interesting about it is I was like a frat boy. I've told you all this before. So there's a lot of drinking in college, but, I stopped drinking and I started thinking. And I was smoking a lot of pot at that point in time. And I went through a season of tremendous intellectual and spiritual growth while doing this. I got straight A's for the first time in my life and continue to get straight A's. And I was growing in my faith, and I worked at a restaurant, and I worked with some Rastafarians in Columbia, Missouri, of all places, and I got to be friends with them. And if you know anything about the Rasta faith, weed is not for the purpose of getting wasted, it's for wisdom. And I hung out with them, and we would smoke pot and read the Bible. I'm not promoting this, okay, as a thing to do. I'm not endorsing this. I'm just telling you my story, okay? And so there was some good during this, and I honestly thought for the rest of my life that, hey, the laws were wrong. I didn't care, and this was going to be part of my life. And all that reading and engaging in my spirituality led me to end up in seminary, which I was like out of the fog of college. I was like, where am I, I'm in seminary. And God's call in my heart started to really call me to ministry. And I understood that my habit could compromise my calling because it was illegal everywhere at that point in time. And so I wanted to change. And the fact that I left my social group in college, that was a relational change, that helped a lot. And then I tried to make, I made practical changes. I just didn't have it. I got rid of it or whatever. And that helped. But down deep inside, I didn't think it was a problem. And I really just kind of wished I could continue. And so whenever it became available, I would. And I was just struggling with that change. And when you nobody's telling you that you should do this is your own thing, I want to make this change, but then you continue to engage in behavior that you don't want to engage in, you start to have a break in your integrity. It's painful. And somewhere along the line, I learned that I needed to move from try harder prayers to trust you more prayers. Because my trying harder wasn't working. And I started praying that God would change my heart, that God would take away my desire for this. And it didn't happen overnight. But eventually, God changed my heart, which changed my habit. Ironically, it's legal in a bunch of places now, and I'm like, I don't even care for it. It's like, life is crazy, isn't it? See, the focus of religion, it's outward. The power of grace is inward. And sometimes you just need to make a practical change. You're like, God, change my heart. He's like, no, if you would just buy healthy food, you could eat healthy, Sometimes it's not that complicated, but oftentimes change is complicated, and there's something deeper going on. And if you got something you can't stop, maybe you need to pray for God to intervene in your life. Religion says, try harder. Grace says, trust me more. The prayer of grace is saying, God, you can change my heart. You can take away my desire for that thing. You can take away my tendency for that. I can't do it on my own. If I could, I've been trying. It hasn't been working out. I just get angry and I explode. Whatever it is that you're wrestling with. But have you actually asked God and believe that God can make a change in your heart? Paul says, this isn't Paul. Paul talks about this thorn in his side I talked about a couple of weeks ago. He understood the struggle of change. And he asked for God to change him, and he wanted the power, and God responds, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. That right in your weakness and your desire for help from me, I can show you my true power. And this is important because, look, you know this. You're only as strong as you are honest. And one of the things that makes you stuck in that habit is you're just not honest about it. But you're only as strong as you are honest. Sin likes to keep things in the dark, keeps you stuck. But when we're honest, then we can deal with something. Because trusting in grace, it gives you the spiritual security you need for honesty. All of us have the struggle. Am I okay? Am I valued? If I'm honest about that, will I be rejected? I was seriously afraid of that. Maybe you're like looking for the moment to leave after hearing my story. But you know why I told that story? 2 reasons. One, I'm hopeful that it will be helpful to somebody. And 2, I have spiritual security. You might not accept me, but I know the Lord does. I'm not trying to be boastful. I'm trying to be humble about it. I got lots of other issues I'm working on today. You don't get to hear those stories. But trusting in grace gives you the spiritual security you need for honesty to actually deal for stuff. And you might be thinking, well, isn't asking for help a sign of weakness? No, it's a sign of wisdom. And anybody that's been here, lived long enough, and really tried to change, you know that you need some help sometime. And the fool thinks they can do it on their own. But a wise person knows they need help. Sometimes you need that therapist. Sometimes you need that medicine. Sometimes you need that trainer. Sometimes you need to talk to that friend. But always, always, I think we need to call on the Lord for help. Why can't you stop? Maybe you're trying to meet a need or relieve a hurt with something besides God's grace. Some of you, you're afraid to ask for God's grace because you're afraid that after you ask for it, you're going to do it again. And you think that it's only a one-time thing you get to ask. And so I better save it until I'm really ready. Because if I ask and then I do it again, then I'm a hypocrite. I'm a failure. But the Apostle Paul, he tells us, he says this is good news. He says, where sin increased, grace increased all the more. The unlimited resources of God's grace. You can't ask too many times. It takes time. And look, you don't change by trying harder. Some things, but you really don't change by trying harder. You change by trusting more. When it's a spiritual issue, you change by trusting more. So here's what I'm going to invite you to do. I'm going to invite you to pray this prayer for yourself.